Every action movie has guns. Every action movie has fights. John Wick has those too, but that's not why it works. What makes John Wick different isn't what's in the fight. It's the one question filmmakers keep asking before they shoot a single frame. What is the new rule? What constraint forces John to fight in a way he's never had to fight before? What takes his usual toolkit and breaks it? What turns the environment itself into the enemy? That question, and how they answer it differently every single time, is why this franchise never gets old. And once you see it, you'll notice it everywhere. But to understand where that question comes from, you have to understand how John Wick got built in the first place. Here's something that's true about almost every great action movie. Nothing's original. Guns, martial arts, and assassin stories existed long before John Wick came out in 2014. So if you can't invent a new ingredient, how do you create something that feels original? Think about Shaun of the Dead. That movie didn't invent zombie horror or romantic comedy. It threw them together and let the friction do the work. Think about the Dark Knight movies, which took comic book property and ran it through the lens of Michael Mann crime realism. The result felt like something you'd never seen before, even though every single ingredient was already on the table. John Wick did the same thing. It took close quarters combat and firearms and fused them into a single fluid language. And that combination, the idea that shooting and fighting aren't two separate things, but one continuous movement, that's what made the first film feel genuinely new. But here's the problem with that. Combination alone isn't enough to sustain a franchise. If every sequel just repeated the same language, the same fights, the same style, it'll get stale fast. And the John Wick films know this. So how do you keep evolving something without losing what made it work in the first place? There's an exercise that animation students get early on. The assignment is simple. Animate a character sitting down in a chair. That's it. Just sitting down. The point of this exercise isn't just to see if they can do it. The point is to see how they do it. Because the way a character sits tells you everything. A nervous character hesitates. A confident one drops into it. An arrogant one takes up space. The constraint is fixed. The specificity is what creates something unique. John Wick works the exact same way. Each film in the series introduces specific constraints, new elements that forces the action to go somewhere it couldn't go before. And those constraints are what kept the sequels from just being the first movie with a bigger budget. Take chapter 3. There's a scene in the stable where John has to fight around the horses. That's not just a cool backdrop. The horses are weapons. The scene is built around that specific element, and it creates something you genuinely cannot find in any other action movie. Then there's the knife museum sequence in the same film. No guns. Everyone is suddenly working with blades, and the tempo of the whole fight changes. Slower, more deliberate, closer. The constraint shapes the choreography completely. And the dog scene. Yeah, some people think it goes on for too long, and honestly, fair. But pull the dogs out of that gunfight, and it's just another John Wick action. Put them back in, and you've got something specific to this movie. That's the question the films keep asking. What new elements do we drop into the action that changes the rule of how it plays out? The best example of this in the whole franchise is probably the Dragon's Breath sequence in chapter 4. John gets his hand on a shotgun loaded with Dragon's Breath rounds, shells that ignite on contact. Basically a flamethrower in gun form. And the camera does something it's never done before in these movies. It pulls up into a top-down bird's eye view and follows him through the entire sequence in one continuous take. The inspiration for this is a video game called The Hong Kong Massacre, which has the same overhead perspective, and you can feel it. The whole sequence plays like a video game, with John burning through rooms while fire trails behind him. Now compare that to the famous 22-minute long take from Extraction 2. That sequence is very impressive on a technical level. But long takes aren't new anymore. Atomic Blonde did one. Kingsman did one. Hell, even the first Extraction did one. Just going longer doesn't automatically mean going further. The question was never how long can we hold the camera. The question is what new rule are we adding? The Dragon's Breath sequence answers that question. It's not just a long take. It's a long take with a top-down perspective and a weapon that literally sets people on fire. You've never seen John Wick from that angle before. You've never seen fire used that way in the series. Every element is doing something specific. That's the difference. Specificity doesn't always come from the weapons though. Sometimes it comes from where the fight happens. Take the Paris roundabout in chapter 4. We've seen car chases 1,000 times. Wide open highways, empty streets, cleared for the stunt team. Clean, controlled, safe. This is none of that. John enters a live traffic circle, and immediately the whole thing falls apart in the best ways. No clean lanes, no breathing room. The cars aren't decorations, they're obstacles, they're cover, they're weapons if he's quick enough. Every 2 seconds, something new is trying to kill him. And half of it isn't even an assassin. The city itself is unpredictable. It doesn't care who he is, but it's actively fighting him. So the fight stops being about who can shoot better, and it's now about who can think faster, who can read the chaos better, and find that half-second window. Mission Impossible does something similar, with Ethan being handcuffed in a tiny car through Rome. The constraint here makes the choreography unique. But the difference is that Ethan's constraint is personal. It's something done to him. John's constraint is the world itself. He walked into a roundabout in Paris and the environment became the enemy. Not because anyone planned it that way, just because that's where the fight happened to go. In chapter 1, the action was about precision. By chapter 4, it's about surviving the system, not just the guys with guns. I ran into this exact problem working on my own short film. I had a scene where a character needed to swap out a treasure. Classic Indiana Jones setup. And I knew the second I laid it out, it had a problem. Because the moment an audience sees that kind of scene, they're not thinking about your film anymore. They're thinking about Indiana Jones. They're comparing it, and at that point, you've already lost. So I asked myself, what is specific to this character? What does she have that Indiana Jones doesn't? Well, she has a Mary Poppins purse. She can pull anything out of it. And she has this completely over-the-top theatrical personality. She would never solve a problem quietly if she could sensationalize it. So instead of a quiet, precise swap, she pulls out a radio and a baseball bat. She puts on a helmet and hits a home run. Same function, completely different execution. And suddenly it didn't feel like a reference anymore. It felt like her. Originality isn't about inventing actions no one's ever seen before. It's about filtering familiar actions through something specific, a character, a constraint, an environment, until the result could only exist in your story. When the first John Wick came out, people kept talking about the reloads. And I get it, there's something weirdly satisfying about watching someone reload a gun with that much fluency. But the reload itself isn't the point. It's a symptom of something bigger. Think about competitive video games for a second. If a game has no mechanical depth, no room to improve, no skill ceiling worth chasing, it doesn't matter how flashy it looks, the players will leave. Because what keeps people engaged isn't spectacle, it's skill expression. John Wick is built on that same psychology. If all he does is aim, shoot, and repeat, it gets shallow fast. But the films constantly show the mechanical depth underneath. Reloads, weapon swaps, problem solving under pressure. In chapter 3, the movie literally pauses a chase scene so John can disassemble an antique revolver, rebuild it from spare parts, and fire one clean shot. We've seen him take out multiple guys with his bare hands. He didn't have to do all that, but the fact that he could and that he chose to tells you everything about who he is. There's a moment in the final fight where Sharon reloads a shotgun. And then the film immediately cuts to John reloading the same weapon. Faster, smoother, no wasted motion. You don't need anyone to explain that John is on a different level with weapons, you just feel it. It's the same reason people watch cooking videos even if they never cook. Watching someone perform complex tasks with complete competency is just satisfying. We're not watching violence, we're watching proficiency. The precise, detailed way the mechanics are shown is what makes that mastery believable. And that detail, that specificity in how John handles his weapons is exactly what separates a scene you believe from a scene you just watch. It's the same principle at work. The more specific the mechanics, the more real the world feels. And the more real the world feels, the higher the stakes when that world starts to fall apart around him. Most action movies treat enemies as obstacles. They exist to get shot, to move the plot, and then to disappear. John Wick does something different. It uses its opponent as a way to force the action itself to evolve. The first film keeps things simple on purpose. The enemies are mostly generic mobsters, and that's fine because the movie isn't about complex opponents yet. It's about establishing who John Wick is. The enemies exists to demonstrate that myth. Chapter 2 starts adding specificity through character relationships. Cassian is introduced as a professional equal, another assassin. Same level, same training. When they fight, there's a mutual respect underneath it that changes the whole dynamic. But there's also hatred, because John killed someone Cassian was assigned to protect.
Killed my ward. Someone I was close to.
That history is in every exchange, and that's what sets this villain apart from what came before.
An eye for an eye, John. You know how it goes.
Chapter 3 goes stylistic. Instead of more gun wielders, we get ninjas, sword fighters, who can disappear into the shadows, and whose close quarter skills are actually more dangerous than someone with a gun. Suddenly, gun fu alone isn't enough anymore. John has to adapt. And then there's the main guy, Zero, who's a fan of John, which makes the whole fight feel strangely playful, almost like a sparring match between a student and the person he idolizes. That's a completely different tone from anything in the previous films.
I'll catch up to you, John.
No, you won't.
Chapter 4 goes the furthest. Kane is blind, and like Daredevil, the constraint makes his fighting style visually unlike anyone else. He reads sounds, he reads movement, he uses the environment in ways others can't. There's a scene where he uses motion detectors to locate enemies in a room. Or moments where he loses John in the middle of their fight. The movie doesn't stop at those characteristics. Much like the character relationship Cassian had with his ward, Kane also has a complicated relationship with the High Table regarding his daughter, which means his motivation throughout the film isn't just to defeat John. It's messier than that. He's a villain you can't fully root against. Couple that with his carefree attitude, and you've got a pretty unique villain who challenges John in a different way. Even smaller opponents get this treatment. Killa, Scott Adkins' character, is big, but he moves fast. He can keep up with John in ways that a guy that size shouldn't be able to. And for a relatively minor opponent, that specificity makes him unforgettable. And it goes all the way down to the grunts. John fights a violin player, a sumo wrestler, a basketball player who he defeats with a book, armored soldiers that force him to change how he aims entirely. Each film asks what new skill John needs, what new rule changes the fight, what new opponent forces adaptation. The enemies aren't just obstacles, they're design tools. Every single one is asking John and the filmmakers a different question. And that's what really separates John Wick from everything else in the genre. It's not the body count, it's not the budget, it's not even the choreography, though that's an important factor here. It's the fact that every single film asks itself a question before they shoot a single frame. What's the new rule? What constraint forces John to fight differently? What opponent breaks his usual rhythm? What environment stops being a backdrop and starts being a problem? And that's the real lesson here. Originality doesn't come from inventing something completely new. It comes from taking familiar ideas and adding the right specific elements that forces the scene to play out differently. So the next time you're designing an action sequence, ask yourself, what specific elements can I introduce that changes the rules of the fight? Because that's how you turn a generic action scene into one no one's ever seen before. If you want me to dig into any specific scenes or break down another film, drop it in the comments. Please like the video, and I'll see you in the next one.